In the shadow of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, a family's secret stunned even hardened investigators. In 1912, Sheriff Thomas Compton uncovered a horrifying truth hidden for over a decade in Wise County. Eliza Goins, a widowed matriarch, ruled her sons Caleb, Josiah, and Benjamin with religious fanaticism, convincing them their bloodline was divinely chosen. To keep it pure, she commanded they marry her. The truth surfaced when infant remains, children of these incestuous unions, were found beneath the smokehouse. How did this persist in a close-knit community? What broke the silence? Subscribe for more forgotten histories and tell us your local time in the comments. In the autumn of 1898, Wise County, Virginia, was a place where mountains rose like the walls of a natural fortress, where coal seams ran deep beneath limestone ridges, and where communities existed in pockets of civilization separated by miles of unforgiving wilderness. The Blue Ridge Mountains had stood for millennia, their hollows and valleys creating a landscape so rugged that a man could disappear into them and never be found. This was coal country, where fortunes were made and lost in the dark tunnels beneath the earth, where men worked 12-hour shifts for wages that barely fed their families, and where the promise of mineral wealth drew prospectors and speculators from across the eastern seaboard. The county seat required a full day's journey by horse from the most remote homesteads, and in the vast stretches between settlements, the law was often whatever a man could enforce with his own two hands. It was in one of these isolated hollows, a place the locals called Goins Ridge, that a family had carved out an existence far from the eyes of their neighbors. The Goins family had once been known in the community, unremarkable save for their reputation as hard-working coal miners. But that changed in 1878, when Samuel Goins, the family patriarch, was killed in a mining accident that collapsed half a shaft and took 3 other men with him. His widow, Eliza, was left with 3 young sons to raise alone. For a time, people saw her in town, a stern woman in a black dress who kept her boys close and spoke little. Then, gradually, the family retreated. The boys stopped attending the one-room schoolhouse. Eliza ceased her trips to the general store. Hunters who ventured too close to the family property reported being met by the grown sons, now men in their 20s, who warned them in no uncertain terms to move along. The Goins family, it seemed, wanted nothing to do with the outside world, and the outside world, accustomed to respecting a family's desire for privacy, obliged them. The first disappearance that would later be connected to the ridge occurred in the late summer of 1898. A geological surveyor named Martin Hayes had been hired by a coal company to map potential mining sites in the western portion of the county. He was a methodical man, a bachelor from Richmond who wrote weekly letters to his sister. When those letters stopped arriving and Hayes failed to return to his boarding house, his employer made inquiries. The landlady reported that Hayes had mentioned he was heading toward the high country, toward the ridges where few people lived. A cursory search was conducted, but the wilderness was vast, and Hayes was not a local man. The general assumption, spoken in quiet tones over coffee and whiskey, was that he had met with some misfortune in the mountains. Perhaps he had fallen from a cliff face while surveying. Perhaps he had been attacked by a bear. Perhaps he had simply decided to move on to another job without informing anyone. Men disappeared in these mountains. It was a fact of life. 4 years later, in the spring of 1902, another man vanished. Reverend Jacob Whitmore was a traveling preacher who made a circuit through the isolated communities of Wise County, bringing scripture and baptism to families who lived too far from any established church. He was known for his kindness, his willingness to sleep in barns and accept whatever meager payment families could offer. He had been seen heading up the ridge trail on a Sunday morning, his Bible tucked under his arm, telling a farmer he planned to visit some of the families in the high country. He never returned to the valley. His disappearance troubled people more than Hayes's had, for Whitmore was a man of God, beloved by many. Search parties combed the trails but found nothing. Eventually, the consensus settled on a tragic accident, perhaps a fall or a sudden illness that had taken him in some hidden ravine where his body would never be discovered. By 1908, 5 men had disappeared along that same stretch of mountain road, each vanishing without a trace, each explained away by the dangers of the wilderness. And in a small office in the county seat, Sheriff Thomas Compton sat at his desk, a ledger open before him, and studied the pattern he alone seemed willing to see. Sheriff Thomas Compton was 60 years old in 1908, a man who had worn the badge for nearly 3 decades and understood the unwritten codes that governed life in the mountains. He knew that people in Wise County settled their own disputes, that they trusted their neighbors more than they trusted any lawman, and that asking too many questions about another family's business was considered not just rude, but dangerous. He also knew that 5 men disappearing along the same 10-mile stretch of road over the course of a decade was not coincidence, no matter what folk explanations were offered. But knowing something and proving it were entirely different matters, and in 1908, a rural sheriff had precious few tools at his disposal. Compton began his investigation the only way he could, by talking to people. He rode out to the scattered homesteads that dotted the lower slopes of the ridge, speaking with families who had lived in the area for generations. What he encountered was a wall of silence punctuated by vague warnings. The Goins family was strange, people told him. They kept to themselves. The sons were wild, fierce men who didn't take kindly to strangers. Old Eliza was peculiar, always quoting scripture in ways that didn't sound quite right. Hunters had been threatened. A peddler had been run off the property at gunpoint. But no one had seen anything criminal. No one had witnessed a crime. The missing men had simply walked into the wilderness and never walked out, and that could happen to anyone in country this rough. In the fall of 1908, Compton made the journey to the Goins homestead himself. The property sat at the end of a narrow trail that wound through dense forest, climbing steadily until it opened into a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The cabin was a sturdy structure built from hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a few outbuildings, including a smokehouse and a small barn. As Compton approached on horseback, 3 men emerged from the cabin and stood shoulder to shoulder in the doorway. They were large men, broad across the shoulders, with long beards and eyes that watched him with an unsettling intensity. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the cabin, stood a woman in black. Compton identified himself and explained that he was investigating the disappearances of several men who had last been seen traveling through this area. The sons said nothing. It was the woman, Eliza Goins, who finally stepped forward into the light. She was a handsome woman, despite her years, with sharp features and a bearing that radiated authority. She spoke in a calm, measured voice, telling the sheriff that they had seen no strangers, that they wanted no trouble, and that he was not welcome on their land. When Compton pressed further, asking if he might look around the property, the 3 sons moved closer together, a silent wall of muscle and menace. Eliza repeated her refusal with a slight smile that never reached her eyes. The law required a warrant for such a search, she reminded him, and without evidence of a crime, he had no cause to obtain one. She was right, and they both knew it. Compton left the ridge that day with nothing but a deepening conviction that evil resided in that clearing. But conviction was not evidence. The wilderness surrounding the Goins property stretched for miles in every direction, thousands of acres of forest, ravines, and caves where a body could lie undisturbed for centuries. He had no witnesses, no physical evidence, and a community that seemed more interested in forgetting the missing men than in finding out what had happened to them. The investigation stalled, then went cold, becoming one of many unsolved cases that haunted the aging sheriff through the years that followed. He kept the file on his desk, reviewing it periodically, waiting for the break that would never come, or so he believed, until the spring of 1912. In April of 1912, a salesman named Edmund Pierce left Richmond with a wagon full of farm implements and household goods, beginning his regular spring circuit through the mountain communities of southwestern Virginia. Pierce was well known along his route, a gregarious man of 42 who had been making the journey for 15 years. He was easily recognizable by his distinctive brown bowler hat, a gift from his wife, that he wore in all weather, and by his friendly manner that made him welcome even in the most isolated homesteads. He kept meticulous records of his travels and wrote to his wife every few days from whatever town had a post office. When 2 weeks passed without word from him, and when he failed to arrive at his scheduled stops in the eastern part of the county, his employer contacted the authorities. Sheriff Compton took the report with a familiar sense of dread. Pierce had last been seen in a general store near the base of the ridge, telling the proprietor he planned to visit a few families in the high country before heading east. That placed him on the same road where 5 other men had vanished over the past 14 years. But this time was different. Pierce was not a solitary surveyor or an itinerant preacher. He was a businessman with an employer who demanded answers, with a wife who wrote to the governor's office, with connections that could not simply be ignored. The pressure on Compton to produce results was immediate and intense. The sheriff organized search parties and spent weeks combing the trails and hollows near the ridge, but the spring rains had been heavy that year, washing away any tracks or signs of passage. He interviewed everyone who lived within 10 miles of where Pierce had last been seen, and received the same unhelpful responses he had heard for years. No one had seen the salesman. No one knew anything. The investigation seemed destined to end like all the others, with a file closed and a family left without answers, until a young mail carrier named Thomas Brennan came to the sheriff's office in early June. Brennan was 23 years old and had been carrying mail along the ridge route for only 8 months, having taken over the position from an older man who had retired. He was nervous as he sat across from Compton, wringing his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to report. He explained that his route took him past the Goins property once a week, and that he always left any mail for the family in a box at the end of their trail, never venturing up to the cabin itself. The previous week he had arrived to find one of the Goins sons, the youngest one named Benjamin, repairing the fence near the road. Brennan had called out a greeting as he always did, and the man had looked up. What Brennan saw had troubled him deeply enough to overcome his reluctance to get involved. Benjamin Goins had been wearing a brown bowler hat, and Brennan was nearly certain it was the same distinctive hat he had seen Edmund Pierce wearing when the salesman had passed him on the road 2 months earlier. Compton questioned Brennan carefully, asking him to describe the hat in detail, to explain why he was so certain of the identification. Brennan was adamant. The hat was unusual, made of fine felt, with a particular curved brim and a dark ribbon band. He had noticed it because his own father had worn a similar style years ago. When Compton showed him a photograph of Pierce provided by the family, Brennan confirmed that this was indeed the man he had seen, and that the hat in the photograph matched the one he had observed on Benjamin Goins. For the first time in 14 years of frustration and dead ends, Sheriff Thomas Compton had concrete evidence connecting the Goins family to a missing person. It was not much, but it was enough. He began assembling a group of deputies he trusted, men who would not speak of their plans before the time came to act. The journey to the ridge would be made at dawn, and this time he would not be turned away. On the morning of June 15, 1912, Sheriff Thomas Compton and 5 armed deputies rode up the narrow trail to the Goins homestead as the sun broke over the ridge. They arrived to find the 3 brothers already outside, alerted by the sound of horses standing in a defensive formation in front of the cabin door. Compton announced that he had cause to search the property in connection with the disappearance of Edmund Pierce, and that he would be conducting that search with or without their cooperation. The brothers did not move, did not speak, their eyes fixed on the lawman with an intensity that bordered on feral. Then the cabin door opened, and Eliza Goins stepped out into the morning light. She was 58 years old, dressed in the same black clothing she had worn when Compton had seen her 4 years earlier, her gray hair pulled back severely from a face that showed no fear, only a kind of calm resignation. She spoke to her sons in a low voice, and after a long moment they stepped aside. Compton ordered 2 deputies to keep the family under watch while he and the remaining men began their search. What they would discover over the next several hours would exceed even the darkest suspicions that had brought them to this place. The first discovery came within 20 minutes. Deputy James Harlan, walking the perimeter of the property, noticed an area behind the smokehouse where the earth appeared recently disturbed. The spring rains had caused some erosion, and what looked like fabric was visible just beneath the surface. Compton ordered the area excavated, and within an hour they had unearthed the body of a man, buried in a shallow grave less than 3 feet deep. The corpse was badly decomposed, but still wore the remnants of a suit, and in the jacket pocket they found a business card identifying the deceased as Edmund Pierce, salesman. The brown bowler hat was found buried beside him. Inside the cabin, the search revealed a dwelling that was surprisingly well-maintained but sparse, with few personal possessions and an atmosphere of rigid order. In Eliza's room, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, Deputy Harlan discovered a small wooden chest secured with a padlock. When forced open, the chest proved to contain items that clearly did not belong to the Goins family. There was a silver pocket watch engraved with initials that matched those of Martin Hayes, the surveyor who had disappeared in 1898. There was a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles in a case bearing the name of a Richmond optometrist. There was a woman's locket containing a photograph, though no woman had been reported missing. There were 4 different wallets, their papers and money long since removed, but their leather still bearing the impressions of their former owners' names. But the most damning evidence was discovered when Deputy Samuel Croft, searching the smokehouse where meat had once been cured and stored, noticed that several of the floorboards sounded hollow when stepped upon. When these boards were pried up, the deputies found themselves staring into a shallow space beneath the floor, and there, wrapped in rotting cloth, were the skeletal remains of 2 infants. The bones were small and fragile, the skulls no larger than apples, and even hardened lawmen accustomed to death in its many forms found themselves unable to speak as they carefully lifted the tiny remains into the light. Compton emerged from the smokehouse and walked slowly to where Eliza Goins sat on a wooden bench, her sons now in irons, their faces blank with shock. He told her what they had found, and asked her to explain how the bodies of 2 babies came to be buried beneath her smokehouse floor. Her response would chill him for the rest of his life. She looked up at him with eyes that held no remorse, no fear, only a strange serenity, and she said that those children were blessed, that they were the purest souls ever born, and that everything she had done had been in service to God's true plan for her family. In the days following the arrests, Eliza Goins sat in a cell in the Wise County Jail and spoke freely to Sheriff Compton, not as a defendant seeking mercy, but as a prophet explaining divine truth to those too blind to understand it. She told him that after her husband's death, she had received a vision while reading the book of Genesis, a revelation that the Old Testament's prohibitions against incest had been misinterpreted by corrupt scholars who sought to dilute the pure bloodlines chosen by God. She believed that her family carried a sacred lineage that must be preserved untainted by the blood of outsiders, and that it was her duty as matriarch to ensure this preservation. She had convinced her sons, isolated and entirely dependent on her since childhood, that they must marry their own mother to keep the family pure, and they had obeyed without question. The travelers who had disappeared, she explained with disturbing calm, had been necessary sacrifices. Each man who had stumbled upon their property or shown too much curiosity about their isolated way of life had represented a threat to their sacred purpose. The murders had not been acts of evil in her mind, but acts of protection sanctioned by a higher law than any earthly court could comprehend. She detailed each killing with the detachment of someone recounting ordinary household tasks, describing how her sons had lured the men with offers of shelter or work, how they had struck them down, and how they had disposed of the bodies in the wilderness. As for the infants found beneath the smokehouse, she spoke of them with a reverence that made Compton's blood run cold. These children, born of the unions between herself and her sons, had been the holiest of all creations, but their small bodies had not survived. She had buried them with prayers and ceremony, believing their souls had ascended directly to heaven as the purest offerings imaginable. The trial began in August of 1912 and became a sensation that drew reporters from as far as Richmond and Washington. The courthouse was packed each day with spectators who came to glimpse the woman and her sons who had perpetrated acts so unthinkable that many could barely bring themselves to speak the details aloud. Caleb and Josiah Goins sat silent throughout the proceedings, their devotion to their mother unshaken even as the evidence of their crimes mounted. They refused to testify in their own defense, refused to implicate Eliza, and showed no emotion as witness after witness detailed the horrors uncovered on their property. Benjamin, the youngest, had fallen ill shortly after his arrest, his lungs ravaged by tuberculosis, and he died in his cell before the trial concluded, still maintaining his mother's innocence with his final breaths. The prosecution presented the physical evidence methodically, the body of Edmund Pierce with his skull fractured from a blow to the back of the head, the personal effects of at least 4 other victims found in the locked chest. The infant remains that medical examiners confirmed had been born alive and had died within days of birth. But the most powerful evidence came from Eliza herself, whose confession was read in its entirety to a courtroom that sat in stunned silence. Her words revealed a mind so twisted by isolation and delusion that she had constructed an entire theology to justify the unjustifiable, and had wielded that theology with such absolute authority that she had bent 3 grown men entirely to her will. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Caleb and Josiah Goins were convicted of 7 counts of murder and sentenced to hang. Eliza Goins was found guilty on all counts, but the judge, after hearing testimony from doctors who had examined her, declared her criminally insane and ordered her committed to the Southwestern State Hospital in Marion, Virginia, where she would remain for the rest of her natural life. She showed no reaction to the verdict, maintaining until the end that history would vindicate her, that future generations would understand the sacred nature of her mission. Caleb Goins was executed on November 2, 1912. Josiah followed him to the gallows 3 weeks later. Both men died without speaking, their final moments characterized by the same silent devotion to their mother that had defined their entire existence. Eliza lived another 8 years in the state hospital, spending her days reading scripture and refusing all visitors except the occasional minister she would attempt to convert to her interpretation of biblical law. She died in her sleep in 1920, unrepentant to the last. The Goins cabin stood empty for several years after the trial, a place that locals avoided and warned their children away from. In 1924, persons unknown set fire to the structure, burning it to the ground along with the smokehouse and outbuildings. The community never spoke publicly about who had started the blaze, but there was a collective sense that the cleansing was necessary, that the land itself had been poisoned by what had occurred there. Today the site is overgrown forest, indistinguishable from the thousands of acres of wilderness that surround it, but local folklore still speaks of the Ridge of Lost Souls, and hunters still give the area a wide berth. The case prompted significant changes in how Virginia handled missing persons reports in rural areas, leading to better coordination between county sheriffs and the establishment of more systematic record-keeping protocols. But perhaps its most lasting legacy was as a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme isolation, about how a community's silence in the face of suspicion can enable unspeakable evil, and about the terrible power of ideology, no matter how twisted, to override the most fundamental boundaries of human morality. The victims, whose names are now recorded in county records and whose remains were finally given proper burial, serve as a permanent reminder that vigilance and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths are the price we pay for a civilized society, and that the cost of looking away can be measured in lives lost and innocence destroyed in the dark hollows where law and conscience fail to reach.